It's not the time, James, to judge somebody's oratory skills, but I thought Rishi Sunak delivered that absolutely correctly and appropriately, and it seemed heartfelt to me. And of course, today, on the back of that, John Glenn has announced that victims of the scandal will receive interim compensation payments worth £210,000. It's the start of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think actually to blow my old boss's trumpet for a second, when Nadim Zahawi and I were in the Treasury, we got the ball rolling on a lot of this stuff as well. He had a lot of constituents with personal experience about this, and when you hear these stories, it's just heartbreaking. I mentioned just before, we need people in public life who've got skin in the game, right? This idea that not just politicians but other people should be held accountable when things go wrong and get praised, and maybe there's financial bonuses or other kinds of bonuses when things go right. And that's what happens in the private sector. Doesn't happen in so many other walks of life, doesn't happen in the NHS. Instead, we've got a system where you're not allowed to criticise it. Any attempt at talking about not the doctors and nurses, but about the structure, you get labelled as some evil person that wants people to die, blah, blah, blah. Well, what happens when you have the NHS not being criticised and people not being held to account? You get scandals like this where people do actually die. So I hope that this is one of these moments again where we can stop and look at the NHS and say this is not this wonderful system that is beyond all criticism and reproach. Mistakes get made, and when you don't have transparency, when you don't have sunlight getting in, you'll get more scandals like this.
It's interesting that I wouldn't just say the blame game. I mean, the blame game was laid out very well yesterday, of course, in the conclusion of that report, which took many years, but lots of fingers are pointing at all sorts of administrations, civil servants, senior clinicians, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair. But it seems that a particular concern over Kenneth Clarke. Some are suggesting he should be removed from the House of Lords. And I sense, James, that this really comes in previous responses he'd given to this, when we did know a bit more about it, where it was felt that he'd kind of brushed it off as being a bit of a hindrance, nothing worth pursuing.
I think there's a risk that these sorts of things happen, that these words get put into the mouths of ministers, again, by civil servants. So we saw another good example of this with Ed Davey. He was the Minister for the Post Office when he first got in the coalition government, and we've seen what's happened with that particular scandal blow up as well. I think that either you have to have, well, both you have to have a system that have more transparency in these kinds of things, where the state isn't so big and so powerful that it just gets to hush up all of these issues. But also perhaps if we had some kind of, a statute of limitations, so after a certain amount of time, people were actually beyond that kind of being able to be prosecuted or something like that, they could come forward and we could actually learn the lessons properly. We always talk about learning lessons, but learn the lessons properly and move on with these things. Whether it's, you have this where aeroplanes crash and things like that, there's a certain level at which no one's going to be blamed. We just need to know what actually happened so that we can stop it from happening again next time. But when we have these closed shops, whether it's the NHS, whether before the post office, all these sorts of things, from the state being too big and doing too many different things, you never get that kind of accountability that is so common inside the private sector.
Indeed. Let's move on to the story that is also dominating over the last 24, 48 hours. Rishi Sunak has described the application for the arrest warrants at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, against Israeli officials as being deeply unhelpful, I think was the phrase he gave there. Let's have a listen to what the American President Joe Biden had to say.
Let me be clear. We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. And it's clear Israel wants to do all it can to ensure civilian protection. But let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide.
I think I understood half of what he said there, James. Not sure about the whooping in the crowd, whether that's appropriate, but I did back his sentiment there about what is happening with Israel and lumping in Netanyahu with head honchos from Hamas, which seemed rather curious to me.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, aside from it being painful and increasingly actually not funny but sad to see the leader of the free world in the kind of state that Joe Biden is clearly in, he is exactly right on that point, on the point that matters there. Any kind of false equivalency here, that this kind of attempt always happens, and it happens often with this issue that's happening in Israel and Gaza, this horrible war, of a kind of false equivalency, of saying, well, Israel's bad as well because people are dying. And that is not how, firstly, international law works. It's also not how morality works. right? Your listeners should think, in the Second World War, more Germans died than Brits. Does that mean that Britain was in the wrong in the Second World War? Yeah. Of course not. That's not how morality works. It's not just a numbers game. All of the numbers of the terrible victims are the fault of the genocidal, horrendous machine that is Hamas. And again, I've used it there appropriately, I think, the word genocide. If Hamas had their way, every Jew would be killed, whether it's in the Middle East, if they had the power, everywhere else. That's what their charter has long said. That's what these people all believe. If Israel laid down their arms, there would be no more Israel. And if Hamas laid down their arms, there would be no more war. To have any kind of false equivalency like this is just disgusting. And it shows how far, frankly, the termites have burrowed and how long and well that they've dined, to quote Christopher Hitchens on this, that this kind of, frankly, anti-Semitic, I think it gets to behaviour, can be allowed in something like the International Criminal Court. It makes a joke of the whole process.
Yeah, I'd agree. And just sort of on the back of that, Michael Gove has been speaking, delivering a hard-hitting speech warning pro-Palestinian marchers could pay policing costs following a rise in anti-Semitism. Big concerns about from the river to the sea and phrases like that, whatever some people claim that means in if you like, contemporary parlance, we know what it now means. And understandably, I don't know how far Mr Gove will get with this, because I would imagine it's pretty hard to police this, but perhaps it comes too late. But there is a real sense there's been a big hands-off approach to what has been blatant, overt, in broad daylight anti-Semitism.
Yeah, absolutely right. Look, I talked about false equivalencies just now, and there's another attempt here that people try and equate anti-Semitism with this idea of something called Islamophobia. And the big difference, of course, is that there's an ethnic component to Judaism that there isn't to other things, that Judaism is both a religion and that Jews are, to some extent, a race, ethnicity, whatever you want to call it. There is that component there, which is why anti-Semitism is an appropriate word to use, and Islamophobia isn't. Islam, like Christianity, is a proselytizing religion, and anybody of any color or size or whatever can become a Christian or a Muslim. So there is this attempt to try and equate the two and say it's just as bad, and we shouldn't fall for this. This is a bit of sophistry going on here. But I've got one good idea. Perhaps all the people that go on what I consider to be the hate marches every Saturday, if we ask each of them as they start, when you say from the river to the sea, which river and which sea? And if they get it right, they don't have to pay the policing charges. And if they're so stupid, like most of them, that they don't even know which river and which sea, they've got to pay for the policing. How about that?
I think you're spot on. I reckon 9 out of 10 people in those hate marches, those anti-Israel marches, which is exactly what they are, would struggle with that quote, would have no idea, and probably couldn't recognise a flag or name a leader, just to compound that same point. Final story here, James. Job boot camps. Work and Pension Secretary Mel Stride looking at ways to plug the gaps in the labour market left because overseas workers have been hit by new migration rules. There's already these sort of what they call intensive training boot camps. I don't think you will turn up in a field with some sort of former retired army major shouting at you while you do lots of press-ups, shouting, "I want that job, when do you want it now?" And there's none of that going on. But nonetheless, this is a way to accelerate, apparently, people into the workplace. Will it work, though?
Well, I certainly hope so. Maybe that isn't such a bad idea either. Maybe the guys who fail the question of which river and which sea can be sent off for some push-ups in a field somewhere. I think it's a great idea. I think the sad thing that we've got to is that numbers of immigration overall has just become so ridiculously untenable to anybody with half a brain. You can't have net 700,000 people, as we had last year, come into the United Kingdom when we've only built 100,000 or so houses, and there's already a massive housing shortage. No matter if all the rest of them were Shakespeare, you just can't have that system. We should instead have a system where we prioritise quality over quantity of people coming in, so that we get the best from around the world, which it's an obvious truth that we haven't been getting in too many cases. The best will go to America, and in that case, then for the rest of us who are left behind, wages were going to have to rise to fill those kinds of gaps. I think that's an obvious market point here. People say, "Oh, well, that's not very free market of you," but of course the problem is that when you've got an unlimited number of people coming in and willing to work for very, very, very little on one side, but then very high cost of taxation and all the rest on the other, that isn't a level playing field either. So anything we can do to get Brits back into work, I think it's a great thing. Higher wages is a good thing, and part of that is going to have to be lowering migration and only having the cream of the crop coming in for a long time. Yeah, that point on higher wages is clearly crucial to this as well. James, thank you as ever. He is James Price, former government special advisor.